Well, thank you all for taking the time to joining us this morning for the next installment of the Hickey Virtual Learning Series. And today we're going to be talking about our 2021 Global Innovation Hubs Report. I'm David Hickey, Hickey & Associates, and excited joined by my esteemed colleague, Guy Douetil, and we will be speaking on these hubs, our report, our rankings, and really how we are working, how we are seeing day in and day out to navigate this new global order, this new way, this new world as we're going forward into the future. Highlights of what we'll be talking about today. We're talking about a little bit of this new era of location strategy as we build in and what this ultimately means in driving towards the innovation hubs. We'll talk a little bit about this new approach, the shifts in the war on talent. Again, dive in a little deeper into the findings themselves, a look towards the future, and not just for the final couple of weeks here of 2021, but certainly into 2023 and beyond after that, and then open it up for the discussion. For those not familiar with us in Hickey & Associates, we've been around for just about 40 years, and we specialize in location strategy. Location strategy can mean a lot of different things. Site selection, as we're commonly referred as, but what it really is helping our clients navigate the world, navigate their global portfolios, their footprint to find that most optimal location. And doing that, driving that through data, through empirical process, through strategy, through experience, whether it's labor analytics, digging into the supply chain, the demographics, incentives, grants, credits, and the overall picture that falls under site selection. So let's go ahead and get into it. We're going to kick it off with a polling question. And I will open this up now. If you could say, over the previous 18 months, which do you believe have had the largest impact on your location decisions or your clients' location decisions? I will launch this poll now. And if you could choose what you see as the top three, the 5 options being overall disruption of COVID, a work from home, remote working environment that we're in today, and as we're experiencing, as that has certainly evolved, some of the different political changes that we've been facing, as well as, and one of those being Brexit as part of it, but some of the other challenges, whether we're in the European space, in the United States, Asia, wherever that might be, and overall, some of the different green and sustainability agendas that we've seen increasingly in recent weeks, months, but certainly over the past couple of years, and then the overall labor situation that we're all facing. Some of the shortages, the arbitrages, and some of those challenges that we've seen as workforce. And thank you everyone for already hopping right on, and we'll give it just another 15 seconds or so before we'll close it out and share those results. So thank you. Another few more seconds. And we'll close that and we'll share it. So very, very interesting to see that overall, and one of the largest impacts that we've seen over these past 18 months has been on that work from home and the remote working environment. No question about it. The way that we find talent, we work with talent, productivity, and certainly the way that we look at space and real estate and how that's going. And many of our clients, many companies were already going in that direction in some way, shape, or form, but certainly have perhaps increased or expanded or completely changed the way they approached it. That labor issues that we have overall, again, around the world, the shortages, which are driving to a number of different challenges that we have across the board. And I think overall that disruption of COVID, of course, that falls under all this. And I think this is a great lead into the conversation and the discussion we're going to have from here. So again, want to encourage everyone from here to engage, partake, utilize the chat, utilize the Q&A functions. And with that, I will turn it over and the presentation over to Guy. Thank you.
Thanks, David, and welcome to everybody. I think we have a representation from pretty much the Eastern Hemisphere. So, yeah, we talked about, or David was talking about massive disruptions that we're seeing over the last year. I mean, they're all pretty obvious to ourselves. And unfortunately, they continue to happen. The UK at the moment just going through the worst spike in cases in the whole of the 2 years of the pandemic. So more working from home, people, trying to get back. But some of the big things that have come out of it is that the employees have thought about things differently, and commuting has become even more there. Partly it's because of time, partly a bit of cost. You can put green sustainability in there as well. But overall, the power has moved to the employee. We're talking in the US, they talk about the Great Resignation, massive labor shortages, people moving around, and spikes in wage inflation. So, it will depend on what industry you're in, whether you're more office focused or more manufacturing, which of these are impacting you most, but pretty much everyone is being impacted by these. And what we're seeing is, the war for talent isn't new, but it's really ramped up a huge amount more. Particularly in supply chains, we're seeing, you read in the newspapers every day, lorry driver shortages. This is not just in one market. It was happening before COVID happened, and it's just gone even worse now. The tech industry is particularly being badly hit. Everybody wants tech roles in, whether you're a pharmaceutical company or a financial company or a real estate company, you need tech skills in there, and everybody needs to have those. So it's a real fight for the employees. Now, and we're seeing, real impacts on time to hire, on the attraction side, on the salary and benefits that you're having to offer, which then has an impact on retention of staff. And we're seeing some clients have got 20-30% attrition rates in their business, which is a massive disruption to their business. And as I said, having to look at having to pay their existing staff more wages, and unsustainable staff turnover is real impact on your business. So what are the reasons behind that? I think partly is those skill sets are changing. We'll talk about later in the presentation about cost of living changing in some of the major cities, and people saying, well, are these affordable if there's another option where I can go to a lower cost, less dense market. And there's a real different reaction in different countries, in different cities, to how they've dealt with the pandemic, whether they've closed down, kept open. And a lot of companies are now considering that in their location strategies. And then also concentration risk. Have you got too many eggs in one basket? We've got a lot of clients who are saying, yeah, well, suddenly Vietnam's closed down, or we've got all our accounting in the Philippines and that's closed down, and we can't get our people into the office. How are we going to pay our bills? Obviously, we can go a few days, weeks without it, but after a period of time, that becomes a real impact on our business. So what we're hearing is, clients talking about how can we be an employer of choice in that tight talent market. So, what are the employees looking for? I personally think, whilst a lot of real estate experts are talking about what happens inside the office, and don't get me wrong, that is important, but I think a lot of people are ignoring what happens outside the office, about why people want to come to the office, what are they looking for. There's been quite a lot of studies on that, but it's really, offices are not really necessarily the key to attracting staff. You've got a nice big shiny office. They will be how you might retain your staff, but not necessarily how you attract your staff. And moving more to a flexible hybrid working, and giving people the choice. You pay them a lot of money. You trust them to make big decisions for your company or for your clients. So don't tell them how they should work, where they should work, when they should work. And I think there's also, we're seeing a lot more about, what are you giving me beyond my salary? Training, skills. How are you making me better prepared for the future? A lot of companies concerned about that, because you could train somebody and they move. But I think there's been plenty of commentary about in the past. And then we look at, sort of where people want to go. And if you talk to us about this 2 years ago, we were seeing a shift from the suburbs back into urban environments, that live, work, play particularly for the younger cohort who wanted to be closer to where they work, and that was typically in a vibrant urban environment. I still think that's key, and particularly for that younger cohort. But there's also this now balance to, well, perhaps I want to work closer to home or at home. I want to have a choice. I want to understand that. And I think there's a lot of companies trying out different models. I think anybody who says, I cracked it, I know what the future looks like, is deluded, to be honest with you. I think there's an opportunity to consider different models, try these out. But what we're talking about is, well, where is the talent living? Where is it living today? Where was it living before? But more importantly, where is it in the future? Where are those sustainable pools of labor that we can tap into? And that may be completely different location from where you have your major hubs. So you need to think about these things differently. And this whole living and working in the city, I think it's, we did a study earlier this year with instant offices looking about that urban suburban piece, moving more to the suburbs, the closer to home working. And one of the things we did was look at which locations have more propensity for closer to home working. And what we found, there was a very close link between the percentage of people who live and work in the city to those also then have to come in from the outside. So for example, you've got some markets, a Stockholm or a Barcelona in Europe, where a majority of people who live in the cities also work in the cities, or should I say the other way around. If they work in the cities, they live in the cities. They're not commuting from the outside. Whereas in London or Paris, you're seeing the reverse of that. So if in the top right-hand corner, if you've got a more of a suburban workforce and you've got a longer commute, then you've got a higher propensity for that population to want to work at home or closer to home. And I think you can just click through. I think there's a couple of things there, David. So yeah, I mean, you've got some cities which have really long commutes. Then you have some which is a bit surprising, the sort of New York's, Los Angeles, who are expected to have longer commutes, but actually on the global stage don't have that. But that doesn't take into account the other factors of cost of commuting and also length of commuting, or difficulty of commuting. And then if you click on one more. Cool. So what we're saying, to be an employer of choice, how do you become a talent magnet? And we look at it not just from an employer's point of view, but also from a city point of view. Where are those new markets with sustainable and scalable labor pools? Because you want to make a long-term decision in your location. So, just because it's fine today doesn't mean it's going to still be fine in 5-10 years' time. So where are those markets with those sustainable labor pools? Well, what we're seeing is our clients, saying to us, we want to hire where the talent wants to be, rather than expecting them to come to us. We've got a client that we're working with at the moment. They had a couple of hundred job vacancies before COVID. They now have 700 or 800 job vacancies. They have attrition rates of in excess of 30%. And they realized that actually expecting the talent to come to them, to where their existing hubs are, may be naive now in this new era. So they're looking at where are the new hubs, where have people moved to, where can I find that same talent, and maybe at a low cost basis, but more importantly, where there's less competition for it. So, it's also, we talked about, sort of that there was going to be a massive unemployment. We're actually not necessarily seeing that, but we are seeing some skills where people are saying, well, actually the leisure industry, the hospitality industry, and I'm not talking just about people who are in the restaurants or in the hotel, but the people supporting that, they're saying, well, that industry has been really badly damaged. The automotive industry, the aerospace industry. Maybe we can go and move into another type of industry and be retrained or use our skills in a different way. We're looking at labour cost arbitrage. What is the difference on that? And what is the local ecosystem? when we look at innovation hubs, that's a hugely important piece to that. What does the city look like, both from our perspective, but also from our employees' point of view? What's the quality of life? How easy is it to do business in there? And I think COVID, reaction to COVID, and as I say, keeping them open or closed, or how they've treated business and employees during that, will have an impact going forward. So one of my favorite discussion points, anybody knows me, is about, when we're looking about sustainable labor pools, is looking at global fertility rates. So for those people not familiar with this, to have a sustainable population without migration, you need 2.1 children for every woman in that country. So anything here which shows in a dark shaded color has a high fertility rate, i.e. has an increasing and growing population. And it's pretty stark to show that, clearly in Africa, a few areas in Asia, but pretty much the whole of the world has got a decreasing population. And you might have heard Elon Musk talking about his own task of trying to help with that with his, I think it was his third or his fourth child, because he sees it as a big challenge going forward. So it's great that there is a growing population in certain markets, but most of them it's decreasing. And if you go sort of deeper dive on that, when we look at Europe, it becomes even starker. So nowhere in Europe has a sustainable labor pool if you take immigration out of the picture. So France is probably one of the best performing in terms of 1.8 children. But if you get down to some of the other Mediterranean countries of Spain, Italy, Greece, we're down at 1.2, 1.3, massive falling populations. And then you add in on top of that, aging populations as well. There's a real problem brewing up on that, not only in terms of how you support from a GDP growth point of view, how you can look after your aging population, but in terms of that sustainable labor pool. And then in locations like Spain, where you've got a low amount of young people because of the falling fertility rates there, but there is still massive youth unemployment. So that shows some further systemic problems. So thanks, David. I think over to you for the sec.
Yeah, thank you guys. So as we look at overall the talent pools and that sustainability of the talent pool, the future, the growth, the pipeline of skills, of the talent of the different types of individuals and roles that our clients are looking for. And we have the fertility rates. That next step up is certainly on the immigration side. And where is that migration? Where are individuals moving throughout, and where are they mostly going into the different markets? And it won't be surprising when you see some of those major innovation hubs later in the presentation and in the report that do track closely with many of these at the country level here. Those markets that are the largest as far as the inflow on a per annum basis of foreign population, and as well as what is that percentage of the overall foreign born as a share of that population. And when we evaluate, we assess on the global innovation hubs on projects of all shapes and sizes, this is certainly a key area of that foreign born. But one thing that's been certainly fascinating over the past couple of years as well has not just been also the foreign born, but as we start looking at the market in the city level, is that migration within a country itself. Here's just a snapshot of the United States in 2020, and where we saw some vast movement of people throughout the country. Now, some of this has subsided, come back a little bit to more of a normal state. Some of it sped up, some of the different elements that Guy talked about earlier too. But just fascinating to see the darker, the red, the orange are those markets that actually lost individuals in 2020, as opposed to the blues and the greens and the like and the purples where population grew. And many of these folks are not, this isn't an immigration or migration, this is movement of people within the United States. And I think one of those markets, and it does score well in innovation hubs, but certainly as we look going forward, And a misnomer to many is in South Florida. Many would have thought that in South Florida grew, especially with a lot of movement from the New York City metro area. But actually, there are less people living in Miami and in the Miami area today than there were in 2019. You'll see that highlighted in the yellow and orangish color there in the southeast of the United States. The number one driver for that is immigration, and actually tying it back and that lack of it because of those numbers that have dropped significantly in 2020. Again, much of that is coming back to more of a normal trend. But as we see this, as we look at it, especially as we look at it in tomorrow, is part of how we drive and how we evaluate what are those hubs driving innovation, because it's incredibly important to have the people, to have those roles, to have those skills that come in place. I think when we look at many of the markets in Canada, that is very, very dependent on immigration and on that movement of foreign-born population and skills. We will see and have seen some great challenges and some cost arbitrages too, as they compete for markets, unlike so you may have seen in other parts of the world just to today, but due to that reliance on it and just continuing to track. And again, as we look at that country, but ultimately, and as we have in the global innovation hubs, as we're driving down to that market, to that city level for that perspective and for that realm. Another key element as we look at is the affordability of some of the cities that we're in. And much of that, as Guy mentioned earlier, but look at it on the cost of living perspective. And when we're looking at that talent, we're looking at that recruitment, that retention of talent to some of the markets. The Economist Intelligence Unit just released their latest 2021 Worldwide Cost of Living Index. There have been some movers in the mix, and for the first time, Tel Aviv coming in as that most expensive city, followed by Paris, Singapore, Zurich, and Hong Kong. We will see these ups and downs. We see these movements on an annual basis, but it is fascinating to look at it. And some of these markets are surprising as we see what a price per liter of petrol costs and how that has changed, some of it in a directional fashion, but others in ways in markets that weren't necessarily expected for a number of different reasons we don't necessarily dive into today on this discussion, but just knowing and recognizing that cost of living and how important it is. Another thing that we look at, and as we looked at as part of the innovation hubs, is the in and out of jobs and what is the sustainability of that job market and the areas and what it is. And what you can see in this, which is very interesting, fascinating, pre-pandemic, and focusing on some of the US markets, major markets we're all familiar with. And really a lot of that major growth were in many of these hubs that we'll talk about, the largest cities in the US. While some of those losses and where, not as significant on a growth scale and scope, but certainly on a perspective, not some of those major markets, some of those tier 2, tier 3 cities in the US. Fascinating then to say, okay, well, what happened once we got into COVID? And you can see it was those major markets, those major hubs, those that especially rely on that immigration and migration patterns of the past few decades, were many of those that were impacted. Now, New York, LA were significantly hit harder, mostly, and then a big chunk of that is because of hospitality, restaurant, bar, food and beverage, as that was absolutely devastated early on. Much of that has returned, is returning, but it's also fascinating then to see some of those cities that did see natural growth during that time. And looking at a Phoenix, Provo, Austin, these are markets too that not coincidentally are showing and have been showing strongly in our innovation hubs, and again, driving into tomorrow. But as we talk about some of that, we talk about the mobility and into that international student population, because it's one thing to talk about the placement skills, but it's also the students and being able to, one, capture, recruit, take those students into the particular markets, to attend the institutions, and then to stay into the longer run. Countries like Canada, as I mentioned earlier, been incredibly strong with that, but it has been difficult, and it's been difficult overall. Just looking at in North America altogether, some of those numbers, as we look at it, what we saw from 2019 versus 2020, we're starting again to see some of this reverse, but it is happening slowly, and what this overall impact will be, because it is a major driver. It's a major driver in our innovation hubs. But we saw from 2019 to 2020, overall active number of forward students dropped by almost 18%. The K-12, so really those, not quite to secondary, not in uni yet, almost a 25% drop in overall enrollment. So those are the active students that were already in country, that number of altogether. When we look at new student enrollment and we really look to the future into forecasting some of these pipelines, a 72% drop. So only 1 out of 4 that would have typically come into North America, come into the United States to study and to enroll did not came versus that 3 to 4 loss. And just a kind of snapshot on the right there, some of the data from the SEVIS study in the US and showing where actually those biggest numbers were in those biggest drops, and seeing that, and a lot of it coming from Asia Pacific and from Europe as well. But as we drive to it and we look at what are these, it will be about how does that return, how does that recovery, how does that mobility. And when we focus and we look at some of those overall talent magnets, and I'll turn it back over to Guy here, but to talk about, just as we look at it on a European perspective, what are some of those major markets that do focus, and what will be that return, obviously, as we come into 21 and beyond.
Yeah, well, when we talk about innovation hubs, the foundation of innovation is typically based on where are the top universities. And as we all go on to through the presentation, we'll hear about, we're looking at it on a sector basis, whether it's fintech or nanotech, and different universities will have different skill sets that they're training people for. But the hubs, there is very strong correlation as to where the universities are, and big hubs of universities. So, for example, the UK has the highest number of top-ranked universities globally. But just on a European perspective, it has 10 of the top 30 universities. The Netherlands is next with 7, Germany 6. France is pretty low with only 2. Switzerland actually beats them in terms of the top universities. And so there is a strong correlation to that. But as we'll talk later, also you need to have the ecosystems to support that. And looking at a different perspective, one of the new things that we're being asked to focus on when we're looking at locations is ESG, diversity and inclusion. And when you look at this, we look at environmental performance, we look at global gender gaps, we look at inclusiveness. Some of the things, so you look at it from one perspective. So, for example, Japan scores pretty well from environmental performance at the top. I think if you click, David, it will highlight where Japan is. And then it also scores pretty well on the Global Inclusiveness Index as well. So it's #1 in environmental, #3 in inclusive globally. But when you look at the global gender gap, they, on an Asia Pacific point of view, they're right down at #18. So, this is sort of some of the detail that we're looking at and being asked to look at. So which are the ones that we want to go into? If we're going to be investing, growing in any particular market, how are those countries performing from these very important standards as we go into the sort of new eras?
And again, we often get asked, what are some of those? How is site selection changing? How are the way that we're looking at data, we're looking at the process, the overall approach to location strategy? These factors are more and more every day becoming in that forefront and part of it. And I think as we look forward at our global innovation hubs and we look towards 2022 and beyond, these factors here on the screen will get weighed in even more and more. And again, at a market level, but to help drive these location decisions. And at the end of the day, what is driving innovation into the future?
So, we're also, one of the questions is what does the future look like? I personally think, this live, work, play environment will take hold a lot more. People want to, are frightened about going in at the moment, but I think that will then sort of develop into, well, why do I need to go in? Particularly if we go back to that propensity, where do I live versus where do I work? Clearly, if you've got a 5-10 minute walk to work, that's great. You'll go to the office, but most people don't live that close to the office. But so what we might be seeing is more of that propensity. People say, well, okay, I don't want to stay at home the whole time, but I would quite like to go into an office. And is there somewhere close by? And I think a lot of cities are going to have to adapt more than actual offices are going to do to attract people and to look at. And this was developed out by the mayor of Paris and others around the world, but really taken on in Paris to look at it, is the 15-minute city. How can I go and find somewhere I can work, I can live, and I can play all in that 15-minute development. And then sort of the final point before we get into the detail of GIH, what has happened, what has changed in locate strategy in the last couple of years? Well, for sure, talent still matters. Unemployment levels surprisingly have returned to pre-pandemic levels pretty quickly. And there's massive shortages of skills, particularly in certain sectors. And we talked about tech, for example, earlier. People moving, so well, is there a cheaper or more attractive location, both from an employment point of view, but also from an employee point of view? And I suspect actually it's companies looking to see where people have moved to, as David talked about migration. Where are those pools of labor that I can tap into, which is sustainable, as we talked about? And that whole where and how we live, work and play, I think it's changed forever. So careful consideration needs to be put into where are the workplaces of the future. Is there a case for distributed, dispersed offices? I don't think many companies are going to go and say, well, okay, I want to build a whole lot of suburban offices ourselves, but can they tap into the service office market? Not only in suburban locations, and one of the challenges and one of the reasons we did the report with Instant was they need to have those developed in those locations, because there's not many in the outer locations, but also using service offices as overflow in the urban environments. You don't want to design an office for peak hours on a Wednesday at 11 o'clock, nor can you do it for the lowest peak at 10 o'clock in the morning on a Monday or 4 o'clock in the afternoon on a Friday. You have to go somewhere in between. And you need a sort of release valve to offer people if there isn't enough space at that point in time. So I think that will be one of the key areas that we'll see going forward.
So as we've talked through all these different factors and leading into what are those different elements that make a top innovation hub, and as we look at it on a global basis down to that city level, we're going to just quickly pop in another poll question here. So what see, and just as a kind of what you see as the number one factor that makes a top innovation hub? Is it overall access to top talent? Is it a strong investment in R&D and consider venture capital as well? Is it where it's easy to do business and that confidence in business, IP protections, contract enforcement, and the like? Was it overall growth, that startup economy, that startup mentality? And then also, or is it risk and really being able to make investments, drive business, drive pride going forward, but at a lower risk perspective? So just it's like what you think is the number one, and then we'll give it just another 10 seconds or so. Thank you for everyone engaging and participating. All right, close it out there. So we have is overwhelmingly access to talent as the number one, strong investment in R&D coming in second, and then the growth in the startup. All of these factors are important as we look at it. All of them are very critical to the process and to the determination of what makes a global innovation hub. As many of you have seen, we have released our 2021 Global Innovation Hubs report and rankings. It is available on our website at hickeyassociates.com. But what are those key factors? And we really kind of put it in 4 buckets of those main drivers, and all of those that we've already talked about today. First and foremost, innovation and transformation. So those markets that are really driving it forward, and it being innovation, business, strategy, inventions, protocols, and we'll talk about what all that means and really transforming it all together. It's those that are getting a strong investment in R&D, but particularly, and as our report has evolved over time, even more and more of the focus on the VC side, really driving into the future, taking that risk, driving into what we're looking at tomorrow. R&D is still important, still very weighed in, especially on that R&D workforce and that share of the workforce. But many of that is also some of the more traditional investment. We're also looking at what is new and where is that going, where is that investment, and not where it's originating, but where is it being invested in today, and as we're seeing those trends in tomorrow. The talent magnets, what we've spoken a lot about and quite extensively so far. The people side, what are those markets that are driving the skills, the roles, the people, and not just today, but well into tomorrow and into the future. And then that overall learning and collaboration ecosystem that we talk about, those that have strong universities, that have an international student pipeline, that have the community support, have that business friendliness, and all the different elements that drive into it. So as we've ranked out and we've pulled forward our global top 25, and those that have been tracking it and following it over the years, we have seen some major changes, not as much of a disruption up top. Boston has been and has continued to be that number one and number one leader as we go forward, and as we have London being at the highest of the European markets coming into the mix, and Singapore being the highest in the Asia Pacific region. A few of those climbers in this previous poll, Guangzhou, Kuala Lumpur coming into the top 25, Sydney and Melbourne down in Australia, certainly reaching, and then a number of the American markets. And a lot of the American markets in the climb, and why you see so many, is a lot of that is that VC talent. It's also the university ecosystems, but again, that investment into the venture capital and driving forward. One surprise that many comes across is Dubai, and where Dubai comes in. Dubai is certainly in the fascinating market. It's not a market that everyone necessarily thinks to right away of innovation, but as they have certainly been investing in and the UAE into diversifying the economy and for the future, much of that has come into innovation in some of the different industries that we'll talk about in just a few moments. Here's a quick snapshot of the rankings overall on a regional basis, and where we see across the board. As we look at in the Americas, very heavily in some of those major markets of your Boston, San Francisco, Seattle, LA, New York, Toronto being the highest of the Canadian cities and coming in 6th overall in region. Some of the other markets, not necessarily as thought of as highly in innovation. San Diego, probably pound for pound, one of the strongest patent markets in the entire world. Phoenix and their growth in the nanotechnology space and water and solar and some of those industries as we have. When we look at Europe overall, as a whole, we see it at London, Paris, Dubai, being that surprise to many, coming in at number 3, Eindhoven at number 4, and Copenhagen coming in at number 5. And then, turning to Asia Pacific, again, Singapore leading the way with Sydney not too far behind. Seoul, the markets, particularly again in some of that nanotech, automotive, and some of the other industries, Guangzhou and Melbourne coming in and rounding out that top 5. What we did is overall, and as you find in the report, is as we rank out these on a global basis, on a regional basis, we also broke it out by industries. And many of those critical industries that we look at every day that we're dealing with, many that are emerging, many that are traditional, but are certainly even more and more influential every day. So those that perhaps we didn't think about as much 18 months ago, that are even more and more in front today, especially when we're talking about innovation. What we looked at is aerospace, ICT, automotive, pharmaceutical, biotech, medical science, nanotechnology, and fintech. Now I'm going to kind of roll through some of these relatively quickly to as we move forward in much more detail, and certainly in the report. And what we did is we identified the top 25 markets in each of these industries across the world, and those that are really driving. What you'll see here is not in any particular order, besides alphabetical, but you can see some of those markets, and some may be a surprise, some shouldn't be, because of that historical presence in those markets, but then many that are driving that innovation, driving that forward. Looking at a Los Angeles, Montreal, Paris, even into a Toulouse, where we have seen these investments, these large players that have been in those markets for a number of years, and some of those up and comers, even a San Jose, relatively new, or Shenzhen, even a Washington D.C. As far as where a lot of this actual innovation is being driven, maybe not the manufacturing, the OEM and the side of it, but where that innovation, where that research is being done. When we look at ICT, immediately notice one major trend in the space, and that's a heavy focus in China and the United States. As far as that top 10, we see much more of a spread when we look at the best of the rest. It is pretty interesting when we look at overall patent growth, the application for patents and that IP, certainly in the ICT market, ICT industry being the fastest growing overall across the board. Automotive, a very traditional, in many ways, an old industry compared to some of the others that we're looking at. But you'll see some of those very traditional markets that do ride high, that are very heavy in the OEMs and the size of what there are, and very hyper focused. Just as you can see on that stat there, the number of patent activity and the number of IPs and venture capital and R&D investment is pretty much heavily focused in these top 10 markets that you see here, and then spread out on others. The others are some of the newer, some of the EV side of things, some of the autonomous elements. But you look at Detroit, while many are focusing on, is it in the Bay Area and some of that investment? But no, actually in the United States, most of that is still being done in Detroit and in the greater Detroit area, where a lot of that investment, especially in the autonomous side, is being done today, and EV being spread out. But you see some of the other long-term, really powerhouses like a Munich, like a Stuttgart, like a Tokyo, as well into the mix. Pharmaceutical overall, and the drivers, you'll start to see a trend here as we get into some of the life sciences and some of these spaces where Boston, LA, New York City, even Philadelphia are coming more and more into space. Again, much of that is some of that traditional, that R&D that has been there, billions of dollars on a per annum basis that are spent in many of these markets, but others that are growing, others that investment. You're seeing some of it being driven by the government side, like in a Shanghai or Nanjing, but then others in the private space and driving forward, and seeing much more of that driving in the Asia Pacific region as well. Biotech, again, you see a number of those similar markets that are in there with the addition of Copenhagen and Seattle from where it is before. Fascinating. One of the very interesting things as well is this Washington, D.C. being more and more present, and as we're seeing more of that innovation and that research, that development, that future, that VC investment coming into the larger DC greater area, where that's being driven. And again, much of that is co-located with U.S. government in different areas and federal agencies, but it's also in much of that driven on the private side. Medical science, and it's actually, when we look at patents overall, it's pretty fascinating that almost a third of the global patent activity in the medical science, and when we think medical science, a lot of it is the medical device field, is actually based in Santa Rosa. And one of those main reasons are the roughly 1,200 individuals that work for Medtronic in that Santa Rosa area, and that are very focused on that area. But that's where Minneapolis comes in as well. Tel Aviv, a market that we're seeing quite often, Eindhoven, and even into Cincinnati as well, into that realm. Future industry, one that we're hearing about, we're seeing, we're talked about as part of the global supply chain elements, is certainly on the nanotechnology side. We don't talk a lot about supply chain during this presentation, but certainly some of those immediate impacts and disruptions that we saw in early 2020, even some of that in late 2019. But you can see now some of these markets driving forward. When asked, what do we see some of those shifts and changes into from 20 to 21, and what we think into the 2022 rankings will be in nanotechnology, and as well as in fintech, and some of those markets as we're driving. We are seeing it's incredible, some of the technologies that, of course, are coming out of the Bay Area, and some of those that have been investment coming out of New York City, but also what we're seeing coming out of Shenzhen, out of Tel Aviv, out of Singapore, overall in this fintech. And definitely as we look at overall patent growth and we look at the different trends overall along the way, fintech is where much of this investment and on the VC side is coming in and growing faster than any of the other industries. Along with industries and what some of those different driving and leading hubs, we also looked at some of those small but noteworthy markets that are playing above their weight. We try to pick a few of those, a handful that, and representing some of the around the world. Halifax, Canada, one of the kind of unspoken gems, unknown, underrated per se in North America, growing in a great workforce, cost of living strong, and that innovation centric, staying in North America. Gainesville, Madison, two very up and coming, expanding university towns, and with their driving unis, University of Wisconsin-Madison, University of Florida, respectively, you are seeing innovation on a pound for pound basis, certainly there, and what is coming out of it. Gainesville, famously known as from Gatorade, as one of the innovations that came out of that market a number of years ago, and driving and building on that. Don't have to even dig into Oxford and the understanding there and what is coming out of it. We look at pharmaceuticals, we look at life sciences, particularly today. Much of that is coming out of it, and certainly into that greater London market from there. Wellington, one of the most dynamic markets now and fastest growing in the mix, and as Reykjavik as well. And then to kind of close out on some of this and discussion in a lot more detail, again in the report, is some of those markets on the rise. And when you really look at these markets that are on here, one of the major driving factors that they all have is growth. They have growth in population. They have growth in population, particularly in the 20 by 39 cohort, and where that is going forward. And as we look at overall talent pipeline, these are those markets that are driving into that future. And these are a list and a selective few. There are many others on the list as well. So when we turn it off, Guy, anything additional?
Sorry, make sure I'm off mute. I think some of the interesting ones. I mean, in Nairobi, for example, coming in on a market on the rise. It's actually one of the fastest growing economies of sub-Saharan Africa. And what we're seeing, places like that and other locations is where they have a very structured approach to growth and a strong government policy to look at growth, and it's often a collaboration between the educators and universities, the private companies, and the government themselves. And what you're seeing is Nairobi, and you talked about Reykjavik earlier. They actually have clear action plans in terms of how to grow their economies, which sectors they're going to focus on, how they're going to invest, how they're going to collaborate. So it's often that ecosystem that's the most important thing to look at as well.
Great, very good. Thank you. Well, with that, we want to turn it over to you all and open it up for a Q&A session. Again, please utilize the chat function as well as the Q&A function. And there's a couple questions that have come in already, so thank you for those. And I'll handle the first one. That is this: will this recording be available? And it will be. It will be available on our YouTube channel shortly following the presentation. We can certainly share a link on that. And we want to encourage and reach out to anyone that may have additional questions or more interest in the topic to please feel free to reach out to us directly, to either Guy or myself or anyone else on our team. And certainly also encourage, if you haven't already, to download the report. It's available on our website at www.hickeyassociates.com. And for those that visit that may be familiar, as we just launched a new exciting website as well, and very dynamic and interactive and engaging too, and to help drive for that. I will turn a question that just came in as well, and it's pretty coincidental, as it was a similar question we had last year, and I think maybe even asked during 2019, but along some of the innovation and how do we look at these hubs for some of the political challenges? And as we had one of the polls earlier, Brexit as well. And, what are we seeing on some of the impacts as Brexit as a perspective, but, some of these other political challenges and uncertainties that we have in certain parts of the world. And let's just even to look at the European front.
Well, I think Brexit has not, all the fears that were predicted has not been borne out so far. I mean, it's still relatively early days and we've had COVID disruption right in the middle of it. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that. The biggest impact was expected to be in the financial services sector and to supply chains. Supply chains have been disrupted because of COVID. So on top of that, so it'll be interesting to see how that comes out. But my personal view is, big markets, and for sure the UK and London are big markets, have resilience, and they'll figure it out and they'll work it out, and they need to perhaps relook in a different direction. My biggest concern over on a global stage is polarization, which we're seeing in the politics side of things. We're getting, bigger factions rising in the on the right and on the left. You look at the French elections, which are coming up. It's pretty scary. Some of the candidates going into that. But then you're seeing a massive amount of coalition that are being put together, whether it be in Germany or in other locations. So I think stability when companies are looking at different markets, particularly for growth or new investment, they're going to look at that political stability as one of the key risk factors.
And as we continue to see that, and I'll take the next question on what are some of the surprising emerging locations. And one that I noted earlier, and we had in 2020 and continuing to climb is Dubai, and some of that growth of that market and the investment in from the R&D, the VC side, as well as into the town pipelining and being a growing market. And as we look at some of these others, you mentioned Nairobi, and some of these that we see overall as markets around the world with that high fertility rates, with that high growth and that population, especially in the 20 to 39-year-old cohort, and that trend going forward on the population pyramid. But Dubai is certainly one of those that's capturing and utilizing that talent and investing heavily in some of the areas such as drones and some of the even into space and some of those realms that are innovation, and a lot of times what comes out of those industries also trickle down into others and some of the realization and some of the different investments. I think KL, Kuala Lumpur is another one that is fascinating to see its rise and growth, and another, just a lot of it in the population growth, investment, targeted investment, and also even some of the unique place that they are in the world on a geopolitical side, and obviously the giant that ASEAN is today. Some of the markets that have dropped over the years, some of the Chinese major cities, they're still, as you saw, listed as powerhouses across the board, but many of them may be becoming more industry focused, as we're seeing as a part of necessarily that full-on group overall.
Yeah, I would just want to add in a comment, David. I think also is when we look at this survey, we concentrate on lot and growth. So this is our own interpretation. It's a scoring system. No scoring system is absolutely perfect. But what we're trying to do is be forward looking. So watch which ones are growth markets. There are other, within the survey, there are bigger powerhouses, which you just looked at size, might come up further up on rank. But what we're looking is, particularly on growth on younger populations, growth in patents, growth in investment. Those are the key factors that we weight into this. So when we do it individually for clients, they will look at different factors. They'll want to put different weightings on this. So this isn't the answer, but one of the key differences is this report goes in and looks at more factors, more data points than pretty much any other survey I see. And whilst there are other innovation hub or innovation center surveys, we look at, I think it's over 350 individual cities. Most of those just focus on a country basis. And that gives you a whole different picture. You know, people want to look where the country is, but they're investing in a city and a location. And if we, you know, for us, the sustainable nature of that, when you're making a big and long-term investment, is one of the most important factors, which is why we put this so high in the ranking.
Absolutely agree, 100%. Well, with just a couple minutes left, we have one more question that just came in. How does Eastern Europe stand innovation-wise? I'll let you answer that, Guy.
So yeah, I mean, look, there's some great universities, whether you're in Poland or in Czech or Ukraine, some great universities with large numbers of graduates coming out of those, and they're feeding into a lot of the industries that are basing themselves there. But in terms of drivers of innovation, we're not seeing on a global stage them standing out in terms of size. They're in the survey. They rank, but also where, you know, the overall piece is a combination looking across all different sectors. So somebody will say, well, why doesn't Eindhoven come up higher in the ranking overall? Well, it's because it's, you know, it's very well known in particular sectors. You know, particularly looking at medical science. But not necessarily so much in nanotechnology, for example. And I may have got that wrong, so apologies for anybody promote Eindhoven or case from our director there. But it's really Eastern Europe is building, but on a global stage, it's still pretty small, really. And I think it needs further investment, and particularly you look at R&D and VC investment. That will be a telling there. When a lot of money starts going in it from that perspective, I think you'll see, you know, they go up the ranks more.
And as we see more and more of the EU funding and the R&D dollars that come down, and some of the recovery dollars as well, and how then the funds, how that's invested going into the future. So with that, and at the top of the hour, thank you for the questions, and thank you everyone for taking the time and spending that with us to learn more about the Global Innovation Hubs and how we're seeing location strategy and how all of that is and everything and driving into the future and together. So I want to again thank you all for attending. The recording will be available on our YouTube channel soon after. You know, please do visit our website, and if you have not looked at or downloaded the report, it's available on hickeyassociates.com. In the meantime, hope everyone and wish everyone happy holidays and New Year, and I hope all stay safe and sound as we go into 2022. So thank you, Guy, and thank you all again.
Thanks, David. Thanks, everybody.